Each year, the university bestows honorary degrees on persons who symbolize, in an outstanding manner, a record of scholarship or service that contributes to the public good. In honoring these persons, the university recognizes their significant contributions to the world in which we live. Kathleen Hannon Aikenhead, Chair of the Board of Trustees, will introduce our honorary degree recipient and commencement speaker.
Born and raised on Long Island, New York, Doris Kearns Goodwin received her PhD in government from Harvard University and served as an assistant to Lyndon B. Johnson in his last year in the White House. She has become a world-renowned historian, reporting on politics and baseball for over 2 decades, and appearing regularly on network television programs and as an on-air consultant for PBS documentaries. She has authored such New York Times bestsellers as Wait Till Next Year, a memoir about growing up in the 1950s in love with the Brooklyn Dodgers, Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, which was made into a 6-hour ABC miniseries, and No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, the American home front during World War II, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in April 1995, as well as the Harold Washington Literary Award, the New England Bestseller Association Award, the Ambassador Book Award, and the Washington Monthly Book Award. Steven Spielberg's award-winning feature film, Lincoln, was based on her most recent work, Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, which won the 2006 Lincoln Prize for an outstanding work about the president and/or the Civil War, the New York Historical Society Book Prize, the Richard Nelson Current Award, and the New York State Archives History Makers Award. She is currently at work on a new book about the Progressive Era, Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. For her remarkable achievements, Loyola Marymount University is proud to bestow on Doris Kearns Goodwin the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters honoris causa.
Come on over here so you can photo. Great. Not yet.
Oh, yeah. Please join me in welcoming our commencement speaker, Doris Kearns Goodwin. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I am so honored to be with you today, graduates, parents, grandparents, children, and grandchildren, as you gather today to celebrate this significant milestone in all of your lives. And since this is a moment when generations of families come together, I would like to share some thoughts about the lost art of storytelling, which I sometimes fear is undergoing a change in our fast-moving world. I would like to urge you as the years go by to take the time to share your own family stories with one another, to keep the memory of loved ones alive for generations to come. History at its best, I truly believe, is about telling stories, stories about people who lived before, about events in the past that create the contours of the present. By studying the lives of others, we hope that we, the living, can learn from their struggles and their triumphs. For me, history and storytelling were inextricably intertwined from the day that my father taught me how to keep score at baseball games when I was only 6 years old, so I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game while he was at work. And then when he came home at night, I now realized that he listened in rapt attention as I recounted in excruciating detail every single play of every inning of the game that had just taken place that afternoon, but he made me feel there was something special about my rendering of history, even if it was only 3 hours old. I'm convinced, in fact, I learned the narrative art from those nightly sessions with my father, because at first I'd be so excited I would blurt out, "The Dodgers won," or "The Dodgers lost," which took much of the drama of this 2-hour telling away. So I finally learned you had to tell a story from beginning to middle to end. And indeed, when I was only 6, my father never told me then that all of this was actually described in great detail in the sports pages of the newspapers the next day. So I thought without me he wouldn't even know what happened to the Brooklyn Dodgers. Indeed, so fervent was my love of those old Dodgers that I had to confess 2 sins in my first Holy Confession at St. Agnes Church. The first occurred because the Dodger catcher, Roy Campanella, was coming to our hometown. First time I'd ever see anybody outside of Ebbets Field, but it was announced that he was speaking in a Protestant church. In those long ago days, we thought that if you ever stepped foot across a Protestant church, you would be struck dead at the threshold. Or worse still, I feared I might be trading the life of my everlasting soul for this one night with Roy Campanella. So I went to my father in tears. "What are we going to do?" He said, "Not to worry. He's speaking in the parish hall. We're sitting on folding chairs. He's talking about sportsmanship. It is not a religious service. It is not a sin." But when I went to my first Holy Confession, I decided I'd better tell the priest immediately and get it out of the way. He said exactly what my father had said, nothing to worry about. But then he said, "And what else, my child?" And unfortunately, I had another sin relating to baseball, which I tried to hide in between talking too much in church, wishing harm to others, being mean to my sister. He said, "To whom did you wish harm?" And I had to admit that I wished various New York Yankee players would break arms, legs, and ankles so that the Brooklyn Dodgers could win their first World Series. And he said to me, "How often do you make these horrible wishes?" And I had to say, "Every night when I say my prayers." So he said, "Look, I love the Brooklyn Dodgers as much as you do, but I promise you someday they will win fairly and squarely. You do not need to wish harm on others to make it happen. Do you understand?" "Oh, yes," I said. But as I left the confessional, in addition to my normal prayers, he said, "Say a special prayer for our Brooklyn Dodgers." How lucky that my first confession was to a baseball-loving priest. Well, the second root of my love of history can be traced to my mother's chronic illness. She had had rheumatic fever as a child, which left her with a damaged heart. So damaged, the doctor said, that she had the arteries of a 70-year-old when she was only 30 years old. Her illness confined her to our house as an invalid, but she read books in every spare moment she could find, though having only an 8th grade education. The stories in her books carried her to places in the world that she would never see. And every night she would read to me. The only thing I loved more than listening to her read a book was listening to stories about her childhood. I somehow became obsessed with the idea that if I could keep her talking about the days when she was young and healthy before her illness set in, that her mind would control her body and her premature aging would be stopped in its tracks. So I was constantly begging her to tell me stories of the days when she was young. And though my mother died when I had just turned 15, those stories and those hours we spent together reading and talking have kept her memory alive for me ever since. But if my love of history was rooted in those childhood experiences, the fascination with the presidency came from the experience of being a 24-year-old White House intern for Lyndon Johnson. Now, it used to be a badge of honor to say you were a 24-year-old White House intern. It's gotten a little more complicated in modern times. In truth, I was a White House fellow, a fabulous program. Colin Powell was a White House fellow, Wesley Clark. We had a big dance at the White House the night we were selected. President Johnson did dance with me. Not that peculiar. There were only 3 women out of the 16 White House fellows. But as he danced with me, he whispered that he wanted me to be assigned directly to him in the White House. But it was not to be that simple. For in the months prior to my selection, while I was a graduate student at Harvard, I had written an article against LBJ because I was involved in the anti-war movement that unfortunately came out in the New Republic several days after the dance in the White House. And the title of the article was How to Remove Lyndon Johnson from Power. So I was certain he would kick me out of the program, but instead, surprisingly, he said, "Oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can." So eventually, I did end up working for him in the White House and then accompanying him to his ranch to help him on his memoirs, the last years of his life. I must say, the older I've gotten, the more I realize what a great privilege it was to have spent so many hours with this aging lion of a man, a victor in 1,000 contests, 3 great civil rights laws, Medicare, aid to education, and yet so roundly defeated in the end by the war in Vietnam, so sad and so vulnerable that he opened up to me in ways he never would have had I known him at the height of his power. And as I listened to his stories, I made a pledge to myself that as I moved from LBJ to JFK, from JFK to FDR, and finally to Lincoln, that I would look empathetically at each of my subjects and try to understand them from the inside out. Now, it may seem an odd profession to spend one's days and nights living with dead presidents, but I wouldn't change it for anything in the world. My only fear is that in the afterlife there'll be a panel of all the presidents I've ever studied, and each one will be given ample time to tell me every single thing I got wrong, and the first person to yell out will be Lyndon Johnson screaming, "How come that damn book on the Kennedys was twice as long as the book you wrote about me?" But though each of the presidents I have studied have provided memorable life lessons, no story is more compelling, I believe, than that of Abraham Lincoln. Early on, Lincoln showed that he possessed an unusual determination to rise beyond the adverse circumstances of his childhood on the frontier, where his interest in reading and his love of books was considered a sign of laziness in a physical culture demanding constant effort to fell the trees, plant the crops, or simply survive. He was only able to attend school a few weeks here or a few weeks there when his father didn't need him to work on the hardscrabble farm. Altogether, he later lamented, his entire formal schooling amounted to less than 12 full months. But so intense was his desire to learn that he scoured the countryside for books. It was said when he got a copy of the King James Bible or Aesop's Fables or one of Shakespeare's plays, he was so excited he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. The great poet Emily Dickinson once wrote, "There is no frigate like a book to take us lands away." How true for Lincoln. Though he never would travel to Europe, he went with Shakespeare's kings to merry England, with Lord Byron's poetry to Spain and Portugal. Literature allowed him to transcend his surroundings. But there were so many losses in his early life that he was haunted by death. His mother died when he was only 9, his only sister Sarah in childbirth a few years later, and his first love, Anne Rutledge, at the age of 22. In the sorrowful years that followed, he found comfort, however, in the realization that all the people he had loved and lost still lived on in his memory. And he began to dream of a future in which he would accomplish worthy deeds that would then allow him to be remembered after he died. A great ambition grew in young Lincoln, so much more than for office or power or celebrity, but rather, as he himself put it, the desire to leave the world a little better place for his having lived in it. It carried him, that ambition did, through the one significant depression he suffered in his early 30s, when the gap between his position in life as a country lawyer and a lowly state legislator seemed so large between that and his great ambitions that he was never able to bridge it eventually. His friends worried about his depression. They worried that he was suicidal. They took all knives and scissors and razors from his room. And his best friend, Joshua Speed, came to his side and said, "Lincoln, you must rally or you will die." He said, "I know that, and I would just as soon die right now, but I have not yet accomplished anything to make any human being remember that I have lived." So fueled by that worthy ambition, he returned to the state legislature. He won a single term in Congress, though his opposition to the popular Mexican-American War prevented him running for a second term. A few years later, he tried for a seat in the Senate. He lost. He tried again. He lost again. And though his friends were despondent, he refused to give in to despair. He knew that his reputation as an inspiring speaker had begun to grow. Indeed, it almost seemed as if the poetry and drama he had so loved as a child had worked their way into his very soul, producing speeches that still move us more than a century later. And in those early years, he also developed a reputation as a gifted storyteller. People would come from miles around to hear him tell stories. He could stand for hours in a tavern with his back against the fire and tell one winding tale after another. Many had a point, like Aesop's fables. Some were simply hilarious. His sense of humor was incredibly quick. There's a moment when somebody yelled out to him, "Lincoln, you're two-faced." And he turned around, he said, "If I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this one?" There's no doubt, as I've told Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, if Lincoln were alive, he would match them one by one by one. Humor for Lincoln whistled off his sadness. It soothed his melancholy. But most importantly, Lincoln never let his failures define him. Despite his unsuccessful congressional experience, despite losing twice for the Senate, he took the risk in 1860 of running as a dark horse candidate for the presidency, the only office it seemed he had not lost at that point in time. And the rest, as they say, is history. Through his leadership as president, the war was won, the Union saved, and slavery ended forever. In 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, Lincoln invited his old friend who'd been with him during that paralyzing depression, Joshua Speed, to come to the White House. He reminded Speed of their conversation of those 2 decades earlier, and then speaking of the proclamation, he declared, "I believe that in this measure, my fondest hopes will be realized. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." As he was about to put his signature on the historic proclamation, however, he found that his arm was numb from shaking 1,000 hands earlier that day at a New Year's reception, which he typically opened to the public, to backwoodsmen with their muddy boots and diplomats with their braided uniforms. "If my hand trembles when I sign this," Lincoln said, putting down the pen, "all who examine it hereafter will say, 'He hesitated.' Yet I never in my life felt more certain I was doing right." So he waited and waited until he could pick up the pen and sign with an unusually bold hand. But even at that historic moment, Lincoln could never have imagined how far his memory would reach. I was thrilled to find an interview in a New York newspaper at the turn of the 20th century with the great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy said he had just come back from a visit to a remote area in the Caucasus where there were a group of wild barbarians who'd never left that part of Russia. They were so excited to have Tolstoy in their midst that they asked him to tell stories of the great men of history. So I said I told them about Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Frederick the Great and Julius Caesar, and they loved it. But before I finished, the chief of the barbarians stood up and he said, "But wait, you haven't told us about the greatest ruler of them all. We want to hear about that man who spoke with the voice of thunder, who laughed like the sunrise, who came from that place called America that is so far from here that if a young man should ever travel there, he would be an old man when he arrived. Tell us of that man, tell us of Abraham Lincoln." Tolstoy was stunned to know that Lincoln's name had reached this remote corner. So he told them everything he could about them, and then the interviewer said, "So what made him so great after all?" And Tolstoy said, "Well, maybe he wasn't as great a general as Napoleon. Maybe he wasn't as great a statesman as Frederick the Great." But Tolstoy concluded, and generations of historians would agree, his greatness consisted in the integrity of his character and the moral fiber of his being. So that dream to be remembered, which had powered Lincoln all his life, had been realized. The dream that had carried him through his dismal childhood, his laborious efforts, his string of political failures, and the darkest days of the war. His story would be told. Now, for most of us, the chance to have our story told may not be realized in a Washington monument, but rather through the memories of our children, our friends, our colleagues, and our families. Which brings me back at the end to where I began, to those early days when my father's love of baseball created a lifelong love of history. Though my father died of a sudden heart attack when I was still in my 20s, before I got married and had my 3 sons, I have passed his memory, as well as his love of baseball, on to my boys. Though when the Dodgers abandoned us for Los Angeles, I was so devastated I couldn't even follow baseball. Until I went to Harvard, my boyfriend took me for the first time to Fenway Park, so reminiscent of Ebbets Field, that I fell instantly in love and became an equally irrational Red Sox fan. We have had season tickets now for more than 30 years, and I must say, even now I can sometimes sit with my boys and close my eyes and imagine myself a young girl once more in the presence of my father, watching the players of my youth on the grassy fields below, Jackie Robinson, Roy Campanella, Pee Wee Reese, Gil Hodges, Duke Snyder. I must say there is magic in these moments. When I open my eyes and I see my sons in the place where my father once sat, I feel an invisible loyalty and love, linking my sons to the grandfather whose face they never had a chance to see, but whose heart and soul they have come to know through all the stories I have told. Which is why in the end I shall always be grateful for this curious love of history, allowing me to spend a lifetime looking back into the past, allowing me to believe that the private people we have loved and lost in our families, and the public figures we have respected in history, just as Abraham Lincoln wanted to believe, really can live on, so long as we pledge to tell and to retell the stories of their lives. I thank you so much for letting me share these stories with you today, and my warmest congratulations to the class of 2013. Thank you. Thank you very much.